Okay, hello everyone. Hello, welcome and welcome again. So excited that you're all here. We had a powerful opening session, so I hope many of you had a chance to catch the opening session. I just want to let you know that we do have, believe, a question box, and Elizabeth, you can help me with that. So if anyone has any thoughts or comments, you can jot that down in the chat, and I would love to hear anything that comes to your mind during this time together for our workshop. And so I will start off by just sharing a little bit about myself. As Elizabeth mentioned, my name is Nicole Baptiste. I am a national consultant with AHA Process. I'm also an executive at a faith-based nonprofit in South Jersey. I am originally from New York City, so if there's anyone here that's from the state of New York, hello. I was born and raised in New York City. I spent many years upstate New York in the capital region. So, for any of you who had a chance to hear that last session, which was so powerful, when we did our opening session this morning, the last two speakers, Eddie and June in Schenectady, they did an amazing job. And that's where I spent many of my years, my last few years in the state of New York. I was in the capital region. I spent many years in Schenectady. It is an amazing community, especially a community of bridges practice. And so just continuing to hear what's happening there is amazing. I hope you all follow their journey. But again, I was there many years. I began my bridges journey as a certified bridges trainer a little over 8 years ago. And 8 years ago, I was a director at a hospital, and I was also the Bridges champion and the organizational trainer. So I was training within my organization. I had the privilege of training all of our frontline workers to our nurses, our physicians, our practice managers, even our board at the hospital system. And this was in Schenectady. And I was also a community trainer. So I was a part of a group of folks that was training in our community, and we had several of community trainings each year. And it was at the infancy of Bridges Out of Poverty in Schenectady. And to be a part of that and to see how that community has flourished and really advanced this framework is just has been a blessing. It's phenomenal. And so now I am currently based in the Philadelphia, South Jersey region. And so I get this opportunity to continue to share this work, but on a national level. As a national consultant, before everything changed for us in 2020, I was traveling and had an opportunity to meet with several communities, introduce a framework, and really come alongside them. I still get to do that virtually, but again, as a national consultant, it is my honor and privilege to be with you all this morning or this afternoon, depending on your time zone. But again, as we go through today, I will just share just a brief overview of the Bridges Out of Poverty framework. So I would like to hear, hopefully I'm able to see your responses if you are able to drop them in the chat box or question box here. But I actually would like to know, before I jump into this, how many of you have been through a Bridges Out of Poverty workshop? Typically, a day one Bridges training is about 6 hours. I am going to provide this overview for you in about a little over an hour. So this is going to be exciting. It's going to be really condensed, but it's going to be great information. Anyone who's ever been through a training that I've had an opportunity to facilitate, you know that I'm very passionate about this framework. I'm very passionate about the work that's happening in our communities around bridges and how they're advancing it. And so I hope that during this next hour together, you'll have some key takeaways. If it's your first time, welcome to understanding and hearing this information. If it's not your first time, I hope it's a good refresher as we go through this Bridges 101. And again, any thoughts or comments that you'd like to share, I would love to be able to hear them, to read them. And so we'll kind of jump in and kind of get started. So I'm back on, everyone. Thank you for your patience and thank you for your diligence. So again, I shared my introduction. I won't kind of go back into that, but I really want us to jump right into this. Just as we go through this workshop, we'll talk a little bit about what is Bridges Out of Poverty. We will explore a few key concepts and strategies that are a part of this framework. And lastly, we'll be able to share and talk about a few takeaways as it relates to the Bridges Out of Poverty framework. So I do hope that as you leave here today, it can renew your understanding of the framework and you can have some great takeaways. So let's jump in. What is Bridges Out of Poverty? So quick history, this work really began with an initial body of research with Dr. Ruby Payne's A Framework for Understanding, and a framework for understanding poverty. And this body of work, this research by Dr. Ruby Payne really explored economic class, economic environment as it relates to the educational sector in the areas of K-12. But since then, this work has expanded to communities, and that's why we now have Bridges Out of Poverty. And Bridges Out of Poverty, you've heard this even during the opening session, it's an organized way of understanding and addressing poverty in our communities. What's exciting is that Bridges is in over 47 states. There are several Bridges communities of practice throughout our country, but it's also in 6 countries. So it's a really powerful and effective framework that's really beginning to move the dial around poverty in various communities. We have best practices. You can always learn more on our website, ahaprocess.com. But what's also exciting is that when you heard from Eddie and June when they talked about getting ahead and how powerful their stories were, getting ahead, as many of you may know, if you're new to this, it's a program, and oftentimes it's about a 12 to 16-week program, and it's for individuals that are in poverty or under-resourced, and they get to explore the same concepts that we'll talk about today. They get to understand hidden rules and their own mental models and resources and language. And as investigators, because they're not referred to as participants, they're referred to as investigators, they can begin to examine and investigate their experiences in poverty. And what I love is that the facilitator is not referred to as a facilitator, but as a co-investigator. So when earlier Eddie mentioned Sister Chris, she was a co-investigator. She came alongside her group of folks and really helped them to co-investigate their experiences in poverty. It's a powerful program. And again, it's happening throughout many communities across the country. So if you're utilizing Getting Ahead in your community, kudos to you. Very, very excited for your work. And you'll notice also lastly here, Bridges to Sustainable Communities. This is where we're developing these amazing Bridges communities of practice and being able to have like a national collaborative that's happening around this work. So it's truly, truly exciting. Something else I want to share when we think of the Bridges Out of Poverty framework is that it's based on a social cognitive framework. So this model, the Bridges Out of Poverty model, the lens, some of the underlying research of it is the social cognitive framework. And this is research done by Albert Bandura. But what he states in his research is that the marriage between relationships and knowledge, understanding that our knowledge base is developed by how we spend our time. So the marriage between relationships and knowledge, demands of your environment, which can be, is my environment safe? What does my environment look like? And resources, the marriage between all three impact the way we think, how we make decisions, and even our behaviors. So again, this is just to let you know the basis of research that really helps to support the Bridges Out of Poverty lens, that the marriage between all three of these elements here impacts our thinking. Also, as we think about the Bridges Out of Poverty framework, there's also the triple lens of economic class. So if some of you have been through the Bridges workshop before, you may have seen this. This is really a high-level overview of the Bridges work. And as you can see here, there are 3 lenses. We have the individual lens, the institutional lens, and the community lens. But what's important to keep in mind is that for this work to be truly effective, it has to happen at all three lenses. And ultimately, that will impact and shift policy. So, at the individual lens, which is really an important area, I just absolutely love kind of sharing and understanding the concepts that go into the individual lens. This is where we begin to understand our own societal values, our societal upbringing, how do we view the world around us. But what's so important about this lens is that it's key in building relationships and building rapport. And so many times when I do this training, sometimes everyone thinks that we're going to spend the entire day talking about people in poverty or those who are under resourced. But the other side to it is that how do I understand poverty as a provider, as someone who's working in communities and helping to provide services? What is my lens? How do I understand poverty? Did I grow up in poverty? Do I know someone who experienced poverty? So the individual lens is not only understanding the experiences of poverty, but it's also understanding your own lens. It's a very powerful experience if you've been through that individual lens workshop. The institutional lens, which is equally as important, this is where we begin to explore our policies, our procedures, and what's happening at an organizational level. Now, what makes the institutional lens equally as important is that if we're not thinking about how we deliver services, how we provide services, or how we think about our policies, how we're building programs, if we don't explore that lens, we may unintentionally place additional barriers for individuals in poverty. And so it can even negate or frustrate the work that's happening at the individual level. So this is a great way to begin improving organizational outcomes by exploring what's happening within our organization. What does a client life cycle look like? How do we understand the different types of tools that we're utilizing? Again, it's a powerful tool. And then the community lens is where, on a larger level, we begin to improve systems at a community level, break down silos, develop a common language. So it's very, very powerful. And again, as we're captains at all three of these lenses, it will ultimately impact policy and even shift policy at an organizational level, community level, regional, or even state, local level. So if you have had a chance to really dig into this work before, if you're able to jot this in a chat, let me know, from what lens do you view this work? And you can think about the work that you do every day. Do you work directly with individuals in poverty? Are you helping to support individuals and build resources for those that are under-resourced? Then you're viewing this work from the individual lens. Or are you shifting policies at the institutional level? You're viewing it from the institutional lens. So kind of begin thinking about that, because I want you to be able to take away, how do I view this work, and how can I even view it from all three lenses? Another point with the Bridges Out of Poverty framework is that it is not a program. Now, that's something I've heard over and over. We're excited. We're going to implement the Bridges program in our organization, in our community. But that's the key word here. It's not a program. Bridges Out of Poverty is a framework. It's a lens. It's a model. And that's really exciting because it's really not cookie cutter. We can pull from best practices that's happening nationally, but we can learn from those best practices and look at what are innovative ways we can address poverty in our community once we have this aha moment. We have this understanding, this paradigm shift, and understand this framework. And that was key when I worked in my community in New York around with this Bridges framework. It was utilized to help us drive innovation, develop really creative programs. But another important piece, and you heard this during the opening session, is that Bridges is a power equalizer, and it brings a voice to those that are oftentimes marginalized or those that are under-resourced. And that's important. And that's really what's one of what makes Bridges so effective. To be able to bring a voice to those that are experiencing poverty, having that voice at the planning table and at the decision-making table is huge. So again, Bridges is not a program, it's a framework. However, Bridges helps to improve relationships at an individual level, improve organizational outcomes, and also change systems at a community level. Those are those three lenses again. So now let's think about, how do we define poverty? And this is important as we go through our time together today. When we think of poverty, and I share this over and over and over, it's not only about a lack of money. Oftentimes, poverty can be equated to a lack of financial resources. And we see that even in how we assess poverty with our federal HUD guidelines. It's usually looking at some type of income. That's a part of it, but the Bridges framework helps us define poverty as the extent to which an individual does without resources. Now, that's important because, again, when we think of poverty and we think of it as the extent to which an individual does without resources, it lets us understand that it's not only financial, there are 11 resources, and when resources are low, it increases the chances, higher chances of experiencing poverty. And so again, there are 11 resources, and when these resources are low, how can we explore as communities and as providers how to build these resources? Financial is one of them, but it's not the only one. And that's what I wanted to point out, that we understand poverty as a lack of resources. And that's really a key takeaway. Here's another key point here. Here's a key point here. I'll share a couple throughout our time together, is that when we think of poverty, it's along a continuum. And so generational poverty and situational poverty are different. And if you're able to chat with me, that's great. If not, I do want to ask this question. You can think about this. I ask this question all the time. So if you've ever been in a workshop with me, you may have heard this question before. But when we think of generational poverty and situational poverty, they're different. Generational poverty is when two or more generations have experienced poverty. So that means grandma experienced poverty, mom experienced poverty. Today, I am in poverty. However, situational poverty is when it is initiated by a life event. So that can be a divorce, it can be downsizing within an organization, it can be bankruptcy, it can be death in a family, debt, and now I even hear even our current landscape, it's initiated by a life situation. But one of the key takeaways with the continuum of economic class is that poverty, wealth, middle class, economic class is relative. Poverty is relative, middle class is relative, wealth is relative. So poverty in a developing country may look a little different from poverty here in the US. So my question I want you to think about is, if a family has an annual income of $175,000 a year, would that family be considered in poverty, in middle class, or in wealth? So an annual income of $175,000 a year, would that be poverty, middle class, or wealth? And I always hear mixed responses. Oftentimes I hear, well, Nicole, that's wealth, that's stability, or it might be upper middle class. But a few times I'll hear, well, Nicole, it depends. And this is where we begin to understand that poverty is relative. Middle class is relative, wealth is relative. So with this family, if this family has 11 children, 7 of them are in college, it kind of shifts the dynamics a little bit when it comes to that $175,000 a year. So again, when we think of poverty, when we think of middle class, when we think of wealth, it's relative. And that's really, really important to really think about. Another key point that I wanted to share is that I'll kind of go right into it, but another key point is just really, again, keep it in mind that poverty, middle class is relative, but we also do this work from the lens of economic class. So again, that's something I want you to keep in mind. It's not from the lens of social class. So there's no ladder of social class when we think about this framework. It's from the lens of economic class. So there's no poverty, middle class, wealth. There's no ladder. And that's great because we get to take the time to examine three different environments that are distinct, they're diverse, and we get to spend the time to examine them: the environment of poverty, the environment of middle class, and the environment of wealth. So, again, this work is from the lens of economic class. So, now let's kind of begin thinking about some key concepts and strategies. And so I want us to jump right into that. When we think of the Bridges framework, here are a few key concepts that if you get a chance to go through a full day workshop, we get to dig into this a little bit more, but we'll touch on them today together. So we will talk a little bit about mental models of economic class. And so that kind of goes right into the idea of mindset and understanding societal experiences. There's also the poverty research continuum. So, what does the research say about poverty? What does causation look like? What are the areas of research when we think of the areas of poverty? When we think of poverty, what does again the research look like? We'll touch on hidden rules, and then this is really important, having an awareness and understanding of hidden rules. We'll also spend a little bit of time discussing language and cognition. We'll touch on family structure, and we will close out digging into resources. Because as you remember a little earlier, I mentioned that as we define poverty, we define it as the extent that an individual does without resources, and there are 11 resources. So it's really important to understand what are those 11 resources, and as communities, how can we really begin to explore how to build those resources to support families and individuals in poverty. So let's kind of begin looking at some of these key concepts, and we'll start off with mental models. And so this is so important because mental models, as you see here, it's internal pictures of how the world works. So what's really key is that mental models, they are our paradigm. It's how we view the world around us. And you'll also see here that it exists below our awareness, and that they are theories that we often utilize, but they are unexamined. So what does that mean? If you've ever heard someone say, wow, you sound just like your mother, or your father always did that, or didn't grandma always say that? If you find yourself utilizing theories, it comes from our societal experiences, it comes from our upbringing. But oftentimes, when we think of our mental models, there are theories that we may utilize, but oftentimes they're not examined because it's what we saw growing up. It's what mom always said. This is how dad did this. I don't always know why, or maybe this is why we did it, but again, we don't always examine it. And that's what's very powerful when thinking about mental models. It determines how we act. And so when we begin to think about mental models as it relates to economic class and economic environments, we have to ensure that we have an accurate understanding of poverty. It has to be a true, concrete understanding of the experiences of poverty, because that's important when we think about the work that we do each and every day, when we think about how to really begin to address the challenges of poverty in our communities. Having these accurate mental models are key. So usually I would spend time asking my groups that I'm with to create, what does the mental model of poverty look like in your specific community? So here's a mental model here. It's the mental model of poverty, and this was created by a group living in poverty, a Getting Ahead group in Ohio. And oftentimes the elements are pretty much similar. Even when I do trainings and I introduce this work to various communities, many of the same elements are there. But this is what I want you to think about as we take a look at the mental model of poverty. You'll notice here that relationships is in the center of this mental model. And this is where we think about, if I am experiencing poverty, or if a family is under resourced, how are they spending their time? And this is why we have these several elements. Someone or a family might be spending their time trying to figure out transportation. And that comes up often, throughout this work or in various communities or even in organizations, and you may see it in the work that you do, transportation is often a challenge or a barrier for families or individuals in poverty. And spending a lot of time on it might mean that I don't have a car that can take me across town to this appointment, and across town by car is 15 minutes. However, because I have to rely on public transportation, it might take me 2.5 to 3 hours. So that's my mental model. This is how I'm spending my time. 15 minutes for me becomes 2 hours, and it becomes 3 buses, and trying to figure that out just to make my way across town. And I might miss the bus as well and have to wait for another bus. So this is what the experience is like. Childcare, trying to figure that out. I've always asked this question: how much is childcare a week? And it ranges. I've heard, Nicole, it's $250 for one child. It might be 300. Trying to figure out childcare. If I cannot afford it, how am I figuring that out? Food, housing, utilities. So really trying to think about what is that concrete experience like. But as you can see, as I mentioned earlier, relationships is in the center of this mental model. This is where we understand that relationships is what stabilizes this environment. So when we think about the economic environment of poverty, if I cannot afford childcare, most likely it might be mom, or it might be my aunt, or it might be my sister, or friend, where we barter. Relationships become the stabilizer. It really is what helps keep this environment from falling apart. It's what keeps me from falling apart in this mental model. And so, again, it might be childcare, it might be transportation. But one thing that I know I've heard before, certain communities, there are times where it's a community where you'll find it's like a community transportation program, but it's not through an organization. It's because um, Uncle Ray has his car, and so what he does is everyone knows that you rely on Uncle Ray to get around, and it becomes a community car and a community transportation program, but it's not a real formal program. So again, relationships are key. Relationships are needed for survival, and that's something I definitely want you to keep in mind. You'll notice that the businesses in under-resourced communities are very interesting as well. I always like to explore this when meeting with groups and really developing those mental models in local communities. And these are businesses that you'll typically find in under-resourced communities. But what's interesting is that many of these businesses oftentimes exploit the people who are living in those communities. So if we think about it, the rent to own or the rent a centers. As many of you may know, if you're familiar with that, the interest rates are super high. Or the check cashing institution. And I always ask, why would someone utilize a check cashing organization as opposed to a financial bank, a financial institution? And if you're familiar with check cashing places, the interest rates can be up to 150%. If you're cashing an $800 check, after all the fees and interest rates come out, you're looking at probably about $600, $640. And so these, again, are institutions you'll find in communities that are under-resourced. Fast food restaurants, the laundromat, the rent to own. And so I do this learning exercise all the time, and it's just interesting to hear more and more about what are the businesses that you'll find in under-resourced communities. Now, why is it important that we take a look at this mental model? We are exploring how is someone spending their time. So if someone's in the economic environment of poverty, how are they spending their time in the circle? But then outside the circle, what does the community look like? That's so important because many times as community organizations or as providers, we develop plans for people who are in poverty or under-resourced. But how do we keep in mind the experience of poverty when we're developing plans? How do we keep in mind what the community looks like? And does a person have the resources to carry out these plans? So this is just the beginning of understanding that. We'll dig into that a little bit more. But again, this is the mental model of the economic environment of poverty. And if you're taking notes, your takeaway is that relationships is the driving force of this environment. Relationships is the stabilizer. It's reactive. There's a lot of concrete solving of problems. Relationships are key. Now, this is a quote I just always love to share. When we think of tyranny of the moment was coined by a Brazilian activist, Paulo Freire, and in his work, some of his work includes Pedagogy of the Oppressed, but Paulo Freire describes poverty as the tyranny of the moment. And this is how he describes the experience of poverty. So essentially, he's stating that the experience of poverty is being in a place of crisis after crisis after crisis. You are in the tyranny of the moment. And there's so many examples of how that plays out. It can be the car breaks down. Once the car breaks down, I'm struggling to make it back and forth to work. I miss too many days. I'm late to my shift. I lose my job. Now that I lose my job, I'm unable to afford my rent. My utilities are now shut off. Now I'm dealt with an eviction notice. I'm unable to afford childcare. I begin to lose all of these things become unstable. So Paulo Freire describes the experience of poverty as being in the tyranny of the moment. And if you remember our mental model, one element on that mental model, something goes wrong with one of those elements, it becomes a compounding factor that's going on. It becomes a snowball effect. And so again, tyranny of the moment is a place of crisis after crisis after crisis. Now, here's a good quote here. The need to act overwhelms any willingness people may have to learn. That's very important. The need to act overwhelms any willingness people may have to learn. And I love to stress that because I ask this question as well. How many of you have work that involves some type of new learning? Whether you are building life skills, you're helping your families and individuals to build life skills, financial planning, resume critiquing, job search, how to do interviews. Sometimes the thought is if we can teach new skills, develop these plans, it'll help address the needs. The plans are great, but how do we keep in mind that when it comes to the tyranny of the moment, the need to act may overwhelm any willingness people may have to learn. And so that kind of goes back. I remember I did a Bridges workshop about 2 weeks ago, and someone one of the participants made such a powerful point, and she said, Nicole, so are you telling me that we really need to focus more on how to build rapport, build relationships, build resources, as opposed to stressing the mental bandwidth and trying to add additional stressors on one's mental bandwidth? And I said, yes, that's so powerful. How can we be effective by helping to build those resources, but not thinking about that word non-compliant, which Terry Juicy Smith mentioned it earlier, especially when we think of healthcare. This idea of this person didn't follow through. Why are they not following through? Or this individual is non-compliant. How do we keep in mind the need to act? Now, again, this is the tyranny of the moment. The need to act may overwhelm any willingness people have to learn. So that's something I just want you to keep in mind. But we get to explore that a little bit more. Terry also touched a little bit when Terry Juicy Smith did her workshop on Bridges to Health and Healthcare. She talked a little bit about the socioeconomic status gradient. And this is according to Dr. Robert Sapolsky, a neuroscientist who studied the impact of poverty and how the stress of that on our neurological system. And so in his research, he states the wealthier you are, the healthier you are, the poorer you are, the sicker you are. And I thought Terry did a great job at really helping us to understand that it's not entirely due to access, but living in poverty is a risk factor for stress-related illnesses. That extended, constant experience of poverty is stressful. And I won't even get into it. If any of you have ever been through a poverty simulation, which is an activity. It's about a 3-hour activity that exposes its participants to 1 month in poverty, and you have to survive it. If you've ever been through that, you can understand that poverty is stressful. And this 3-hour activity, when I went through it, was 3 hours of my life. However, this is someone's every day, their waking, breathing, walking moment. And poverty can be stressful, very stressful. So again, it's not only due to a lack of access to healthcare, but it's also due to living in poverty is a risk factor. It is a risk factor for stress-related illnesses. So if there's someone that needs to ask a question, Elizabeth, I'm not sure if you wanted to ask a question. If you do want to pop in, I would love to hear it.
Okay, so it says, in these relationships that are the driving force and hold things together, how or what is the approach in this model when those relationships are maladaptive?
That is an excellent question. If I knew the name of that person, I wanted to let you know that's a great question. When we go through this workshop, we explore resources, and we also explore your human and social capital. And this is where, when we think, if you remember, I mentioned when resources are low, the chances of experiencing poverty are high. So we have to also examine our human relationships, because they can be a resource, but you're right in terms of it can be a negative relationship. It can be a relationship that does not support the need for change, or doesn't support one bridging out of poverty. So when we do that, we begin to explore the idea of bonding resources or bonding relationships, which really is what we talked about earlier. These are the relationships that I call you if I have an issue, or if I'm in need, or if I need help, I need to rely on you. You become a part of my bonding resource. You're my bonding relationship, and you help me to stay together so I don't fall apart. But there's also the idea of bridging resources or bridging relationships. And so we look at the idea of relationships from these two different perspectives. And the bonding capital and bridging capital is different. The bridging capital, meaning my bridging social human relationships, are those key individuals that help me to bridge out of poverty. And so when we talk about resources, there's this opportunity to help families and individuals assess their resources, but also begin to identify who are your bridging resources in your mental model. That may be one of you on this line. Oftentimes it can be someone who's working closely with the family. It's a nurturing and positive relationship. So that was a great question. Relationships can be healthy and a little unhealthy, but we have bonding and bridging relationships that we look at when we explore resources. Thank you, Elizabeth. If there's another question, Elizabeth, feel free to let me know. If you have a question, please jot it in the chat box. I want to hear your thoughts. If you have a comment, I definitely want to be able to read your comments and just answer any questions you may have. So as we continue on, this here is the mental model of middle class. And as you can see, this mental model looks a little different from the mental model of poverty. And the one idea here is that the driving force is different. As you can see, the driving force is achievement. And the reason for that is when we think of the economic environment of middle class, there's this idea of a future story, the future story. And a future story is the ability to build and develop and plan your future story. So here you'll see some elements that may lend to a future story, such as careers, home ownership, higher education. And the reason why achievement and the idea of the future story is possible here is because this is an environment of stability. And when there's stability in the environment, I don't really have to worry about surviving necessarily. I'm not really focusing on today and getting through surviving. It allows me the opportunity to plan ahead, which is why home ownership becomes a possibility, which is why retirement, because that can take 2 decades to retire, that becomes a possibility. The future story is more evident here. And you'll notice the businesses in a middle class economic environment looks a little different as well. Now we have the mental model of wealth. And here, when we think about the future story, it's a little different from the future story of middle class. With middle class, you can think you're able to really plan out a couple of years out. But when we think of wealth, there is the idea of a future story here, but what's interesting is that the future story can look decades out because connections become the driving force here. Now, when we talk about connections, we're more so talking about political, social, and economic connections. That's the stabilizer of this environment. Your political, social, and economic connections becomes the driving force and the stabilizer, and decisions are made based on these connections, and decisions can be made generations out. When we think of wealth, again, there's this place of stability. I may not even be thinking 5 years, 10 years. I'm thinking 20. I'm making a decision today that may impact the next generation. And so what's key is that when we look at all three environments, we explore them when we go through this bridges framework, but we also understand how do we begin to keep in mind that bridges is a power stabilizer. And when we think of all three environments, how do we ensure that all three economic environments are represented at the table? So I'll talk more about that as we begin to wrap up today. So again, back to the mental model of poverty, it's keeping in mind that this environment can sometimes feel powerless as opposed to powerful. There are times that it can be more reactive in problem solving as opposed to proactive problem solving. It can be concrete in nature as opposed to abstract at times. And sometimes the math doesn't work. There's an activity that I do called planning backwards, and the math never adds up. It always feels like you're catching up. Bills are looming. You have resources, but it's not enough. The math doesn't always work out. And so financial security is not always there when we think of this economic environment. And oftentimes the idea of it being unstable and lacking predictability. And of course, we talked about the tyranny of the moment versus the future story. So to kind of really close out this concept here, I want you to look at the last point. When we think of the mental model of generational poverty, at times it could be a depiction of the trap. There's very little future story because, again, we're in this tyranny of the moment. Very little choice because there's not much predictability sometimes, and very little power. But this is what I want you to also take away. When we think of the mental model of poverty, we're looking at relationships. When we think of the mental model of middle class, we're thinking about achievement and plans. And many of our institutions operate on the hidden rules of middle class, where planning and achievement is key. And that's important because we want our families and our individuals that we come alongside and work with to succeed, want them to achieve. But what's important is that oftentimes we're not always keeping in mind that relationship piece that trumps the planning. So how do we not throw away the planning? We keep that, but as communities, how can we be intentional where we can help families and individuals that are experiencing the tyranny of the moment to also adopt and embrace the planning? That's where I encourage you all to be really intentional about the work you do, how to think about that tyranny of the moment. And that requires a very specific level of intentionality to be able to support, build resources, and help to develop and embrace the plan. We don't throw away the plans, but how do we bridge the relationship and the planning so that we can really begin to affect change in our communities and in the lives of the families that we're supporting and individuals. So really quickly, I just always enjoy sharing this because when we think of tyranny of the moment, it doesn't only occur with individuals. Tyranny of the moment is a scarcity mindset, and it also can be experienced in institutions and communities. That tyranny of the moment. So here, there's a quick chart I wanted to share. As you can see here, when we think of individuals experiencing the tyranny of the moment, an individual may live paycheck to paycheck. However, an institution might operate grant to grant. And if that grant doesn't come back around, that institution may fall apart. Communities of annual budget to annual budget. Or if you think about an individual that passed up on education, but oftentimes institutions, because of the tyranny of the moment, may have to cut professional development. So again, when we think of the tyranny of the moment, the Bridges framework really helps us to explore what's happening at the individual, the institutional, and community level. How can we build resources at all three levels and keep that in mind as well? So we can talk very briefly about what does the research say about poverty? Like what does causation look like? What are the areas of research when we think of poverty? And this is really interesting because when it comes to research on poverty, there's the understanding that there is a research continuum. And as you see here, there are four areas to the research continuum. There's behaviors of the individual. So that means the decisions that I make personally may impact me if I'm experiencing poverty. There's also the absence of human and social capital within a community. So that's really thinking about what does the condition of my community look like? Where are resources lacking? There's always the example of a single mom. She works during the day, so she decides to go to school at night, take classes at night at the local community college, so that she can really begin to bridge out of poverty. But the last bus stops running at 6 p.m. If you're familiar with that, if you know in your community, I've been several places throughout the country, from Midwest to East Coast, West Coast, and I hear it all the time. There are communities where there's very limited public transportation. It may end, the last bus is at 6 p.m., but my class ends at 8 o'clock at night. So again, that's an example, but what does the conditions of the community look like? That's another area of research. The third area of research is human exploitation. And this is where we really begin to think about um, groups that are marginalized and oppressed, and really keeping that in mind, thinking about institutional racism, and even thinking about what are socioeconomic challenges. So human exploitation is another area of research, and oftentimes that area of research can be overlooked when addressing the challenges of poverty in a community. The political economic structures, this is where we take a look at policies and legislation and what's happening systemically, and is our systems broken or what's working. When we think about addressing poverty in our communities, it's important to think about all four areas of research. Oftentimes, policies, programs are developed based on isolated research, meaning we have high rates of teen pregnancy. So we developed this program, but it only addresses, as what we're trying to address is the behaviors of the individual. But we sometimes neglect what's happening in a community. How does this program incorporate the research on human exploitation? What are some political economic structures? Quick examples, back to Schenectady, which is an amazing community of practice. If anyone here is from the capital region or from Schenectady, Albany, Troy, and the state of New York, very exciting that you're on. When I worked in Schenectady and I was the trainer in my organization, I was the director of social work services. We had just begun adapting and advancing bridges in our organization and community. We had a community needs assessment that was done in the most innovative way, and we did it through adopting the Bridges lens. And one of what came up in our research is that our community, which Schenectady, we talked a little bit earlier about, is a very small county in the state of New York. The state of New York has 64 counties. Schenectady is the second smallest county. That's how small Schenectady is. It's one of the smallest counties in the state of New York, but statewide, Schenectady ranked number 3 in high adolescent teen pregnancy rates, which is mind-blowing. It's a small county, but the adolescent pregnancy rates were super high, and it was even comparable with New York City. So what we did as a community when thinking about the Bridges framework, we began to explore how do we address this from all four areas of research. We have Schenectady still does have an amazing community, a Bridges community. It's an amazing community of practice. And so there were so many different elements that helped with that being successful. I chaired an adolescent pregnancy work group. We also had a teen aspect to it. So we had teens that were a part of the work group. We had providers a part of the work group, and we were able to address and shift the culture around adolescent pregnancy from a comprehensive approach. Mind you, in one academic year, we had over 100 young girls pregnant in one high school. And so it really took the community coming together. And again, the framework helps us to organize how we address some of the challenges in our communities. So here are some topics. You can find more if you have the Bridges Out of Poverty book. If you don't, I encourage you to go and purchase the Bridges book. You can go on our website, ahaprocess.com. But you can learn more about what are some topics that you'll find within the research continuum under each area of research. And this is a tool here that many communities are utilizing to address the causes of poverty comprehensively, utilizing all four areas of research. So let's jump into hidden rules. And again, if you have any thoughts, comments, let me know. I hope I can see the chat. But when we think of hidden rules, and again, hidden rules is very fascinating. Hidden rules are unspoken cues and habits of a group. What I want you to keep in mind as we begin to go through hidden rules today is that it's not meant to predict behavior, and that is very important. It's not meant to generalize or predict behavior or place behavior on a group of people. It's really helpful to understand the unspoken cues and habits of an environment and its patterns that develop from an environment. So I'll share with you some general hidden rules. Many of you have your own, but just really quickly, I always share my family's from a small island, Caribbean island called Haiti. And one of our cultural hidden rules is that when you come into a Haitian household, you greet everyone by giving them a kiss on the cheek. That's just common. It's not spoken. It's not written anywhere. It's a hidden rule. You just know it. You do it. Hidden rules are easily broken. So if someone doesn't know that, they'll come in and may not greet everyone with that kiss on the cheek. But I always share this when I do in person. If I were to do an in-person workshop, I'll share with everyone. If I started this workshop today and I came and gave everyone a kiss on the cheek, would that be weird? It would be. So it's the hidden rule in my home, in my culture. However, it comes from the environment, comes from my culture. So I would not be able to do that at a workshop, obviously. But again, hidden rules are unspoken cues and habits of a group. I've heard everything from in the Midwest, when you drive down the road, everyone greets each other with this special greeting wave. If anyone is on this line, on this workshop, and you're out in the Midwest, you may know what I'm talking about. I heard that before. I hear that people who ride motorcycles have a special wave and how they say hi to each other on the road. These are all hidden rules. They're unspoken cues and habits of a group. Now, hidden rules also exist within economic class and economic environment. So that's important. So when we think of hidden rules in economic class, we can understand that they exist everywhere. Again, hidden rules are not meant to predict behavior. It comes from the environment. They're easily broken. But what's important is how do we understand more than one set of hidden rules? And getting ahead, the investigators also begin to understand, oh, wow, I have a set of hidden rules, but there are other hidden rules, which helps me to develop, whether it's language when it comes to negotiation or understanding that oftentimes institutions utilize the hidden rules of middle class. Families and individuals may bring with them the hidden rules of poverty, and then there may be a clash. So how do we understand as communities, as organizations, providers, more than one set of hidden rules? And in getting ahead, it's the same experience. But I just wanted to touch base on a few. Money, it says here that money is to be spent in poverty. That's the hidden rule in poverty. I always ask why. Many times, the response is, well, Nicole, it could be, we don't know when we're going to get it again, or I don't have it, so when I have it, I'm catching up on bills. But in middle class, money is to be managed and wealth invested. So hidden rules are different. The other one is I wanted to touch on is education. I know we have many educators on the today with us during this national conference. In poverty, education is valued. However, it may seem abstract, meaning it doesn't seem concrete or attainable. Middle class is crucial for climbing the ladder of success. Wealth is a necessary tradition. And I've had groups where I've done hidden rule activities, and they've said to me, in my home, the hidden rule is everyone goes off to college. It's not even discussed. It's not a question. It's unspoken. It's just expected. But in poverty, it may seem a little abstract, as if it's almost not a reality. And so I'll share that it can be because I didn't see anyone before me go off to college, or there's no aunt, no uncle. My parents didn't go off to college. I'm first generation. So there's this chance that it can be viewed as abstract. But how do we understand this when we are helping families, individuals build resources? Two key points here. Most schools and businesses operate from middle class norms and hidden rules. And also, individuals bring with them the hidden rules of the class in which they were raised. So these are some important takeaways as we think about hidden rules. It's not meant to predict behavior. It can be very fluid. But again, it's patterns of an environment, and they are easily broken. I won't spend too much time on language, but I know this morning we talked a little bit about it during our opening session. And Terry in her session talked a little bit about frozen language, formal and casual language, which I want to touch on. When we think of formal language, it's oftentimes the language of negotiation. And when we think of casual language, it really focuses more on nonverbals. It's casual, but then there's this emphasis on nonverbals. And oftentimes there can be communication barriers. And as the example that was given this morning, someone is with me, I ask them what happened, and as they're telling their story, I'm looking at my time. I already broke that relationship because that nonverbal is a part of casual language. And it's a part of survival, that casual language piece. Being able to assess your environment, being able to know the intentions of those that you're having conversations with. So observing the nonverbal becomes a huge part of casual language, but it's also a survival piece as well. So as you can see here, formal is very direct. Casual can be circular in nature when we think about storytelling. The story might begin in the middle or at the most climactic part. But how do we keep in mind the different registers of language, and that nonverbals are really important when we think of casual language? Quick study here. I won't spend a lot of time on this study, but I wanted to just mention that this study really looked at poverty on the young brain. And it was a study done with children ages 3 to 20. And what it shows is that when it comes to childhood stress, how that can impact language development at a very early age, and even brain development. So one of our last points even states that stress in childhood has been shown to make people more prone to depression, heart disease, and even addiction in adulthood. This study helps us to understand what's happening at a very early age, even prior to birth, and how that impacts the young brain, and how the stressors of poverty of a mother can impact the development of the young brain, even prior to birth. So it's a very, very interesting study that, I definitely encourage you. You can definitely take a look at it. And I wanted to touch very briefly on family structure versus family function. This is another concept that I wanted us to kind of take a look at. And really, this helps us to think about when we consider economic environments, what's happening in the household? What does that household dynamics look like? So there's this understanding that family structure is the configuration of the relationship. So there's mother and daughter, father and son. It's really the configuration of the relationship. But what's important is family function, which is the extent to which a child is cared for and nurtured. So there's this idea of family structure versus family function. But how do we understand when we think about household dynamics that family function is really important? How do we begin to think about that? And it's the extent to which a child is cared for. So structure is not always the most important issue. So family function stability is what really is truly important. The extent to which a child is nurtured and cared for. An example sometimes would be if you've ever met any individual and they're like, oh, this is my aunt, but there's no blood relationship. It's not biological, but there's a relationship. Or if you ever heard, oh, cuz, this is my cuz, this is cuz here, this is cuz there. We're all cuz, and we're family. But it really becomes that family function as opposed to the family structure, and really understanding that when we think of household dynamics. So now I want to close with this last concept, which is resources. I touched on it at the very beginning of our workshop. I mentioned that we define poverty as the extent that one does without resources. So here are the 11 resources. I have a few here, but there's 3 additional resources that was added by Getting Ahead graduates. But these are the resources that I wanted to share. There's financial, which I mentioned that poverty is not defined only by a lack of finances, but that's one of the areas that plays a role in poverty, that a lack of financial resources, and that's the ability to purchase goods and services. There's emotional, and this is being able to choose and control emotional responses. That is a resource. There's also mental. Now, mental is cognitive. This is the ability to read, write, compute. Again, that is also a resource. The ability to read, write, and compute. This is our cognitive resource. There's also spiritual and believing in a divine guidance. Physical, having physical health and mobility. Support systems. Now, this goes back to that amazing question that was asked earlier. If you have any other questions, I hope I can see them in the chat box. But the question box. But this goes back to the question earlier about relationships when we think about the economic environment of poverty. There are support systems, which is really kind of thinking about bonding capital, bonding relationships. Like you're a backup resource. I need you in times of need so that I don't fall apart. It helps me to survive. But there's also bridging relationships, which are role models or positive, nurturing relationships. So during the opening session, Eddie Polanco told his story about getting ahead and what he went through. And he talked about Sister Chris and how she came alongside him and he didn't want to disappoint her after the class. So after getting ahead, he had to think about how do I stay ahead, and how she came alongside him and supported him and really became a positive relationship, a bridging resource. So that is very, very important. Oftentimes that is missing when we think about the economic environment of poverty and resources. The bridging relationship many times is missing. And how do we begin to think about how to build that relationship, build rapport, but also help with that bridging out of poverty. And then knowledge of hidden rules, as we talked about, that is also another resource. These 3 additional resources added by amazing Getting Ahead graduates, and I think they are very powerful. Integrity and trust. Your word is good. You do what you say you're going to do. Motivation and persistence. Having the energy, the drive to plan, to complete projects, and to make personal changes. That's a resource. And formal register. I talked a little earlier that formal language is a language of negotiation, and understanding formal register, and that is a resource as well. So again, there's 11 resources. It's not only about money. So here's some next steps and key takeaways as we close out our time together. And again, you can find more information about Bridges Out of Poverty on our website, ahaprocess.com. We offer full trainings. So I know I gave you some a lot of pieces to chew on during our time together, but I really want to ensure that you have a few takeaways and key next steps. As you remember, we talked about the idea of the tyranny of the moment and what plans look like. The need to act may overwhelm any willingness people may have to learn. Meaning, I have a 48-hour eviction notice. I may not be following up with that plan. But how do we, as communities and providers and those who are coming alongside individuals and co-investigators, help to be intentional? The very unique place to be where there is this intentionality of understanding the tyranny of the moment and not throwing away the plans, but being able to embrace the plans, embrace the relationship piece. And so that's what I wanted to have as a key takeaway, that one of our key takeaways is that no significant learning occurs outside of a significant relationship. Now, I'll repeat that again. This is by Dr. James Comer, who is a child psychologist, and he's done amazing research on the impact of poverty and on inner city children, and did a lot of great work in the education sector. And he states that no significant learning occurs outside of a significant relationship. And if we think about the work that we do and it involves some type of learning, new concepts, skill building, financial literacy, again, all the different types of work that we do, health planning, treatment plans, healthy lifestyle, no significant learning occurs outside of a significant relationship. And that is something I really want you to take away. We looked at this even at the beginning today, the idea of relationships of mutual respect. And that's how relationships develop, when they are relationships of mutual respect. And this is also, as Terry Juicy Smith mentioned, this was created by one of our amazing AHA process consultants, Susie Johnson, and she really helped to create this here. But it really helps us, and she even thought about this based on Stephen Covey's work. But how do we look at having same-size circles, because these are relationships of mutual respect, and information flows both ways. It's called shared learning. Again, it's a shared mutual respect, and it's not a big circle talking at a little circle. It's not me telling you what to do. It's not me articulating your experiences for you, but it's understanding that tyranny of the moment, understanding hidden rules, mental models, languages, resources, and lack of, and being able to have that understanding and information flowing both ways in a very respectful space. So again, that's a very important key takeaway. According to Stephen Covey, change happens at the speed of trust. So again, how do we understand and take away that relationships are key, relationships are important. Also, building a Bridges community. So keeping in mind that there's an entire roadmap. Again, Bridges is in 47 states, 6 countries internationally. There's amazing work happening at many of our communities of practice, our Bridges communities. But keeping in mind that we begin to educate the resource. This is where we're thinking about professionals and organizations, beginning that training, beginning to develop that language, understanding mental models, understanding the concepts, but also educating under-resourced through Getting Ahead. Again, as you all know, Getting Ahead is a powerful program, and communities are utilizing it and seeing success with their investigators. And so that is another part. And then exploring how to then begin to build a multi-year approach to addressing some of the issues and challenges on a community level, really looking at bridges to sustainable communities and addressing poverty on a larger community level. So those are some 3 steps. You can find more information on our website, but and you'll have the slides, but this is Launching a Bridges Initiative. It's an amazing step-by-step process on how to do that and how to begin to offer the Bridges training, how to begin thinking about developing a steering committee, looking at sector partnerships. So again, there is a step-by-step process of how to really launch a Bridges initiative in your community. If it's already happening in your community, I encourage you to be a part of it. If you are already a part of a Bridges community, I'm so excited for you. I had that experience to do that work really boots on the ground in my community, and it is an awesome experience. You really begin to see the impact of how that really begins to shift the dial around the needle around poverty in your communities. So lastly, how do we ensure that the planning and the decision making table is diverse? So that's really important, ensuring that all sectors, political persuasions are at that planning table, seeking to bring each and every economic environment at that table. There are strengths in each economic environment. There's problem solving strengths in all three. So ensuring that all three are at the table is also a key takeaway. And I definitely want to just briefly mention a four-part story. I won't go into mine. I wanted to, but for the sake of time, I just want to let you know that this is the future story. This is what communities are doing to develop a future story as they embrace the Bridges framework. They begin to think about this four-part story. What was it like in our community? What insight did we have from Bridges that made it possible to bring about change? What change did we make based on that new insight? And what is it like now? What is it like now for our families, for our communities, and for our individuals? What are the outcomes? So many communities have four-part stories. I have a personal one from the hospital. But again, I definitely want you to begin thinking about your four-part story. If you're already a part of a Bridges community, what is the future story? This four-part story is a key takeaway, and it just helps you to really begin to map out the future of your communities, but ensuring that all voices are represented. And even the voice of someone experiencing poverty is a powerful voice, and that voice is at the table. I'll close out with this last slide. Anyone who's ever heard me um, facilitate this workshop, I love this slide here. It's so powerful. I've always shared the first time I saw this was many years back. In graduate school, I went out to New Orleans and we did work post Hurricane Katrina. And then it came back again when I began my career and began the Bridges work. This quote came back again. So it's followed me. But it says here, if you have come to help me, you can go home again. But if you see my struggles as a part of your own survival, then perhaps we can work together. And I want to just leave you with that. As we think about the work that we're doing, as we think about relationships, building rapport, how do we keep in mind that if you've come to help me, you can go home again? But if you see my struggles as a part of your own survival, meaning we have fresh eyes, not only on our experiences, but the experiences of others, then perhaps we can work together. So I hope you all had an amazing takeaway. I look forward to, Elizabeth, if there's any last questions that I missed, if you can let me know.
Yes, just really quick, somebody did comment on that it'd be interesting to see how COVID and community closures are going to affect casual language. And then same person, Kristen Canny, says it seems significant learning can occur by personal failure. So those were just two of the comments, if you want to comment on them as well.
Sure. No, those are really great comments. I've heard that, over the last few workshops that I've done, how COVID and this current landscape we're in, how that impacts even the work we're doing, but in terms of the casual language piece and even thinking about mental models. And so I know many communities now are really trying to be really innovative with the Bridges framework and trying to explore how to continue this work virtually. But many times when I've worked on that mental model learning activity, technology always comes up, and a lack of technology for families, individuals in poverty. We're seeing that even with education right now. I'm hearing a lot of families are struggling with even virtual school. So right now it's still coming together, but many communities are trying to tap into that virtual piece to continue the work with getting ahead with the trainings. I've still continued to have trainings with communities throughout the country around this work virtually. But in terms of the casual language, yes, we're going to see it continue to play out. So I think that's a great comment. And then the comment about the personal failures, Elizabeth, I think as it relates to, can you repeat that one more time really quick?
Sure. It says it seems significant learning can occur by personal failure.
Yes. I think that's a great point. I know we talked about the resources and how the Getting Ahead graduates, they had those 3 resources that they added because, they're the ones experiencing the concrete experience of poverty. So that voice is important when thinking about if this resource is low, I can experience poverty. And learning from your personal failures, one of the resources is motivation and persistence and being diligent and still pushing through. And so I think that's a great point that comes out even more in the resource of motivation and persistence. So.
And we actually did have one more comment
Okay.
from Christine Skinner. She said, may I ask? So she said, the 11 resources don't appear to include mental health, just physical and cognitive health, as pertaining to literacy and learning abilities. We know that all the components, physical, mental, emotional, and social health, are connected and is shown in evidence-based research to impact each other to such an extent they cannot be removed from one another as more significant than the other.
Awesome point. Oftentimes when we begin to think about mental health, and I'm glad you actually mentioned that, Christine, many times I've had folks mistaken the mental resource for mental health. And I always have to let everyone know that that's a cognitive resource. But many times we'll understand the mental health trauma piece. We'll see that more play out in the emotional resource. And so I am glad that you brought that up. That comes up many times when I do this training, the whole understanding of mental health. And again, that oftentimes will play out in the emotional resource. Trauma-informed care and all those pieces will play out in the emotional resource. And not in the mental. Mental, again, is cognitive. So I'm glad you mentioned that and allowed me an opportunity to clarify that piece, that we can really begin to further understand mental health through the emotional resource.
And that was it for the comments. We did have Lauren Valadrez. I can't pronounce the last name. She's the one that found the horse icon. She found Phil, so I let her know who to contact. But
awesome. I'm glad you found it. I tried to put it in there very discreetly, and I could have even missed it. That's how I really was intentional. You have a great eye. Awesome job, Lauren. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking this time to be with me today. This was awesome. I really enjoyed your comments, your feedback. Again, if you want more information, you can find it on AHA Process's website. You can learn more about the Bridges Out of Poverty framework. And I encourage you as you continue to stay safe and healthy. And again, thank you.